John interrupted the award show, walked past the winners. What he did left the industry speechless. London, 1966. The Royal Albert Hall, draped in the velvet pageantry of the music industry's most prestigious night, glittered with the self-satisfied luminescence of power. The winners were already chosen. The speeches were already written. But what if, in the carefully choreographed theater of fame, John Lennon spotted something that shattered the illusion? And what he did next left every executive, every winner, every camera in that hall pointed in the wrong direction, stunned into an absolute, devastating silence. The year is 1966. London, a city burning with the vivid, restless energy of the Cultural Revolution it had largely ignited, was the undisputed capital of the music world. Carnaby Street pulsed with colour. Nor the Thames reflected the neon dreams of a generation that had decided collectively and with tremendous force that the old order was finished. And nowhere was the old order more entrenched, more self-perpetuating, more resistant to genuine disruption than in the marble corridors of the music industry. The annual Music Industry Awards ceremony, held at the Royal Albert Hall on a cold February evening, was the industry's most elaborate ritual of self-celebration. It was an event designed by the powerful for the powerful, its guest list a careful curation of influence and commerce, its awards determined not by artistic merit alone, but by the complex, invisible machinery of label allegiance, radio relationships, and the kind of backroom agreements that were never written down because they didn't need to be. The Beatles were there, and as they were required to be. Their presence was not optional, not truly. They were the industry's greatest asset, its most reliable engine of profit, and their attendance at events like this was understood to be part of the unspoken contract of their fame. They would arrive, they would be photographed, they would accept their awards with the practiced graciousness that Brian Epstein had spent years cultivating in them, and they would leave. John Lennon, in his tailored suit and his round glasses, looked the part. He always looked the part when it was required. But beneath the careful surface, the restlessness was always there, the sardonic intelligence that could not be entirely suppressed, and the instinctive distrust of ceremony and hierarchy that had been part of his character since the streets of Woolton had first taught him that the world was divided into those who held the doors and those who were kept outside them. He did not know, arriving at the Royal Albert Hall that February evening, that before the night was over, he would encounter a boy standing outside one of those doors. A boy whose talent was real and whose humiliation was equally real. And that what he chose to do, in response to that encounter, would interrupt the most prestigious night in British music, expose the rotting machinery beneath its glittering surface, and leave an entire industry speechless in the most devastating, most human way imaginable. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful. Like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon. In 1966, the world saw a phenomenon in its absolute prime. Sharp, mercurial, impossibly gifted, increasingly restless within the boundaries that fame had constructed around him. He was 25 years old and had already lived several lifetimes of experience, and had already seen the machinery of the industry from every angle, had already understood, with a clarity that made him simultaneously dangerous and indispensable to the people who controlled his career, that the music industry was not about music. It was about money wearing music's face. The Royal Albert Hall, with its magnificent Victorian dome and its tiers of red velvet seating, was the perfect setting for the industry's annual performance of Caring About Art. John moved through its corridors with the particular ease of a man who has been to enough of these events to know exactly how hollow they are, and the particular tension of a man who has not yet found a way to stop attending them. He greeted people with the practiced warmth of the experienced public figure, accepted compliments with the deflecting humor that was his signature, and kept moving, always moving, as if stillness might allow the accumulated weight of the evening's inauthenticity to settle on him. Paul, beside him, navigated the social landscape with his usual effortless charm. George moved through the crowd with quiet watchfulness. Ringo, good-humored and unassuming, accepted a drink from a passing tray and found a corner to inhabit peacefully. And John continued to move, drawn by some restless instinct away from the main reception hall, down a side corridor that led toward the backstage areas of the great venue, away from the cameras and the champagne and the careful, performative conversations. It was in this corridor, this in-between space that existed outside the event's carefully managed perimeter, that John Lennon found what the evening had been waiting to show him. Not a trophy, not an industry contact, not another photographer wanting another image of the most famous face in British music. A boy, sitting on the floor against the wall, a guitar case beside him, his face bearing the specific raw expression of someone who has just been told, with great efficiency and very little kindness, that they do not belong here. His name was Daniel Rhys. He was 17 years old, Welsh, with the particular combination of fierce talent and total obscurity that the industry's corridors were specifically designed to keep at a safe distance from its stages. He had traveled from Cardiff that morning on the first train, carrying his guitar and a cassette tape of his own recordings and a letter from a local music teacher who had written, with quiet passion, that this boy's gift was something that deserved to be heard. When he had somehow, through a combination of persistence and the naive confidence of genuine talent, made it past the venue's outer security with the explanation that he had a meeting with a representative from one of the smaller labels attending the ceremony. The meeting had been real, or had seemed real. An exchange of letters, a tentative agreement to listen to the tape, an address, and a time. But the label representative, a man named Gerald Cross, had taken one look at Daniel in the corridor. His age, his clothes, his Welsh accent, his obvious inexperience with the rituals of industry power, and had dismissed him in approximately 4 minutes. He had not listened to the tape. He had handed it back with a comment that Daniel would later recall verbatim, and because certain humiliations have the quality of being permanently engraved. This isn't really the right venue for this sort of thing, son. We deal with professional artists here. John almost walked past him. The corridor was dim, and Daniel was sitting very still, the guitar case across his lap, the cassette tape in his hands, staring at it with the expression of someone trying to understand how something they had believed in completely had just been returned to them as worthless. Almost. But John Lennon had spent enough years on the outside of doors to recognize the specific quality of that stillness. He stopped. "You all right, mate?" John said. Daniel looked up. The recognition was instant, the way it always was, the slight dilation of the eyes, the catching of breath. But Daniel, to his credit, and did not perform the usual fan response. Perhaps he was too depleted for performance. Perhaps some part of him understood, instinctively, that the man standing in the corridor asking if he was all right was not asking as a celebrity. He was asking as a person. Not particularly, Daniel said. John sat down, on the floor, in his tailored suit, outside one of the most prestigious events in the British music calendar. He sat down, on the corridor floor, beside a 17-year-old boy from Cardiff and said, "Tell me," Daniel told him. "Not everything, not immediately, but gradually, the way people talk when they have been genuinely listened to, the words coming first carefully and then with increasing honesty, until the whole story was there between them, in the dim corridor, the train from Cardiff, the letters, at the meeting that wasn't a meeting, the 4 minutes, the cassette tape handed back like something contaminated." John held the tape in his hands as Daniel talked, turned it over, looked at the handwritten label on the side, Daniel Rees, Original Compositions, 1966, written in careful, hopeful letters. "What's on it?" John asked. "6 songs, Daniel said. "I wrote them myself, all of them." "What are they about?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, the question apparently unexpected. "My dad," he said finally. "He worked in the mines. He died 2 years ago. And about Cardiff. And about—" He paused, searching for the right words. "About feeling like the world is very large, and you are very small, and the music is the only thing that makes the size of it feel right." John looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, how old are you?" 17. John stood up. He held out his hand for the guitar case. "Let me hear one," he said. "Here?" "Here." Daniel opened the case and took out his guitar with the careful reverence of someone handling the most important object in their life. He sat for a moment, his fingers finding the strings, and then he began to play. A simple chord progression, nothing technically extraordinary, but underneath it, a melodic intelligence that was immediately, unmistakably real. And then he began to sing. The song was about his father, about the mines, about a man who came home every evening with the darkness still on him, who sat at the kitchen table and drank his tea in silence, who loved his son with the inarticulate ferocity of men who have never been taught that love can be spoken. Or it was a song about absence and presence simultaneously, about the specific grief of losing someone who was never entirely there to begin with. John Lennon, leaning against the corridor wall, listened without moving. His arms were crossed, his head slightly bowed, his eyes closed. When the song ended, he did not speak immediately. The corridor held the last note for a moment and then let it go. "That man who gave you back the tape," John said finally, his voice very quiet. "Gerald Cross." "Yes. He's in there right now," John said, nodding toward the direction of the main hall, "getting an award for services to the music industry." Daniel said nothing. There was nothing to say. John looked at the cassette tape still in his hand. Then he looked at the corridor and then at the distant sound of the ceremony in full swing. Applause, the clink of glasses, the self-congratulatory murmur of an industry celebrating itself. Something shifted in his face, something slow and deliberate and utterly resolved. "Come with me," John said. The ceremony was at its peak. The host, a genial television personality whose name everyone knew and no one could quite recall with any particular warmth, was in the middle of introducing the final and most prestigious award of the evening, Outstanding Contribution to British Music. The hall glittered. The audience, labels chiefs, managers, producers, the industry's most powerful faces, arranged in their careful hierarchies of table placement, watched with the attentive expressions of people who already know the outcome and are waiting for the performance of surprise. The doors at the back of the hall opened. John Lennon walked in. This was not unusual. He had left briefly, and his return would have attracted no particular attention, except that he was not alone. Beside him walked a 17-year-old boy from Cardiff in a jacket that had not been purchased for an occasion like this, carrying a guitar case that had never been inside a room like this, with an expression on his face that combined terror and something that had not been there 15 minutes ago in the corridor. Something that looked, tentatively, like purpose. John did not go to the Beatles' table. He walked through the hall, past the tables of executives and artists and managers, past the careful arrangement of power, toward the stage, toward the host, who had faltered mid-sentence, unsure of the protocol for a Beatle walking toward him, uninvited, while the ceremony was in progress. People noticed. The murmur began at the back of the hall and moved forward like a wave. Cameras turned, heads turned. The host, microphone in hand, watched John approach with the paralyzed expression of a man whose entire script has just become irrelevant. John stepped onto the stage. He gently, without aggression, without drama, took the microphone from the host's unresisting hand. He turned to face the hall. 500 faces of the British music industry looked back at him. "I want to introduce someone," John said. His voice, amplified by the hall's magnificent acoustics, was calm and clear and entirely devoid of performance. "His name is Daniel Rhys. He's 17 years old. He came from Cardiff today to play his music for someone in this room. And the person he came to see gave his tape back to him without listening to it." The hall was absolutely silent. "Daniel," John said, turning to the boy who had followed him to the edge of the stage and stood there now, gripping his guitar case, his face pale but steady. "Come up here." Daniel walked onto the stage of the Royal Albert Hall, the stage where the greatest names in British music had performed. He stood beside John Lennon in front of 500 of the most powerful people in the music industry, and he opened his guitar case, and he took out his guitar, and the hall remained in its absolute, unbreathing silence. "Play the one about your dad," John said quietly, stepping back, removing himself from the center of the stage, giving the space entirely to Daniel. And Daniel Rhys, 17 years old, from Cardiff, played. Though the song filled the Royal Albert Hall the way honest things fill spaces, completely, without apology, leaving no room for anything else. His voice was raw and imperfect and entirely real, and it sang about a man who came home from the mines with darkness on him, who loved his son in silence, who was gone now and left behind a grief too large and too specific for anything except music to contain. There was not a sound in the hall except Daniel's voice and his guitar. Not a whisper, not a clink of glass, not the shuffle of a program. 500 people who had spent their careers deciding what was worthy of being heard sat in complete, devastated silence and listened to a boy from Cardiff play a song about his dead father, because John Lennon had walked past all of them to bring him here. When the song ended, the silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Paul McCartney began to clap, then George, then Ringo. Then one by one, the hall followed, until the applause was the kind that does not sound like an industry's performance of appreciation, but like something older and less calculated, like recognition, like the involuntary response of human beings to something that is simply, undeniably true. John, standing at the edge of the stage, did not clap. He watched the hall, his expression unreadable. His eyes moved across the rows of faces, finding Gerald Cross's table, where the label representative sat with the particular stillness of a man who has just been exposed in front of everyone he knows. John held his gaze for one long, quiet moment. Then he looked away. The ceremony resumed, eventually, and in the way that disrupted things resume, uncertainly, with a quality of irreversible alteration that no amount of procedural normality could entirely conceal. The Outstanding Contribution Award was presented. The speech was made. The photographs were taken. The industry continued its ritual. But something in the hall had broken open, and everyone in it knew it. The careful architecture of the evening, its implicit assertions about what music was and who deserved to stand in its light, had been interrupted by a 17-year-old boy's honest song, and the interruption could not be undone. 3 record label representatives approached Daniel before he had left the building. Not Gerald Cross, who had found reasons to be elsewhere immediately following the performance. 3 others, their expressions carrying the complicated mixture of genuine interest and professional calculation that was the industry's particular way of responding to something it could not ignore. Business cards were exchanged. Follow-up meetings were proposed. John, watching from a careful distance as the industry began its ritual absorption of what he had just forced it to witness, felt something that he would have found difficult to name precisely. Not satisfaction, not exactly. Something more complex. The knowledge that he had done the right thing, tangled with the awareness that the right thing had immediately begun to be processed and packaged by the very machinery that had made it necessary in the first place. Brian Epstein found him in a side room afterward, his expression carrying the weary patience of a manager who has spent years navigating the aftermath of John's impulses. "You know what you did tonight," Brian said. It was not a question. "I know what I did tonight," John agreed. Brian was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Cross is furious." "Gerald Cross," John said calmly, gave a boy's tape back without listening to it. Brian looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the slight, resigned smile of a man who disagreed with the method and could not argue with the principle, "No, he did." The industry's response in the days that followed was the response of institutions to disruption, a mixture of private fury and public posturing, of people who had been made uncomfortable finding ways to reframe their discomfort as concern for proper procedure. There were conversations about the appropriateness of unauthorized stage interruptions at formal events. There were suggestions that John's behavior had been disrespectful to the award's recipients. There were carefully worded expressions of disapproval from people who understood, privately, that no one was going to say them too loudly because John Lennon had just played the room a song about a dead miner from Cardiff, and the room had cried. Daniel Reese signed with a small independent label 6 weeks after that evening. His first album, recorded on a modest budget, was released 8 months later. It was not a commercial phenomenon, but it was reviewed with genuine warmth by critics who heard in it exactly what John Lennon had heard in a dim corridor. Something true, something made without compromise, is something that deserved to exist. John never spoke publicly about what he had done that night. He deflected questions about it with his usual sardonic humor, or simply declined to answer. But in his private journals, recovered and published years later, a single entry from the week following the ceremony read, "Heard a boy play a song about his father in a corridor. Took him into a room full of people who had forgotten what a song is for. Made them remember. Not sure it will last, but it happened." The Royal Albert Hall still stands, its magnificent dome unchanged, its red velvet tiers holding the accumulated echoes of a century of performance. The music industry's awards ceremonies continue, their rituals largely intact, and their guest lists still determined by the same invisible machinery of commerce and allegiance that has always governed them. Gerald Cross retired in 1979. His contribution to the industry is listed in the official histories as significant. Daniel Rhys recorded 3 albums. None of them charted in the conventional sense. All of them are available to those who look in small record shops and online archives frequented by people who care more about authenticity than ubiquity. His second album, released in 1969, contains a song called The Corridor, which does not explain itself, but which those who know the story recognize immediately. It is a quiet, precise, beautiful song about a night in London when someone stopped and listened. Daniel Rhys died in 2019, at the age of 70, in Cardiff, where he had lived his entire adult life, and teaching guitar to children in the community centres of a city that had always understood his music better than the industry ever had. In his obituary, published in a Welsh newspaper, the Royal Albert Hall night was mentioned in a single paragraph that described it as the evening a Beatle interrupted an award show to bring an unknown Cardiff musician onto the stage of British music's most prestigious venue. The paragraph was accurate and entirely inadequate, the way that factual accounts of human moments are always inadequate. John Lennon, who would die 14 years after that February evening, carried the memory of Daniel's song in the way he carried many things, privately, without sentimentality, as part of the accumulated understanding of what music actually was and what the world persistently confused it for. In the years that followed, his own music became increasingly stripped of industry calculation, increasingly insistent on the honest, the direct, the unpolished. Whether Daniel Rhys's song in That Corridor contributed to that trajectory, no one can say with certainty. But the trajectory was real, and the corridor was real, and the song about the miner was real, pouring its truth into the dim air of a backstage passage, while 500 yards away, the music industry celebrated itself in a glittering hall, unaware that the most important performance of the evening was already over, played to an audience of 1 on a floor outside the door. The city breathes, the Thames moves, the Royal Albert Hall holds its echoes. And somewhere in those echoes, if you press close enough to the walls and let the ordinary noise of the world fall away, there is still the sound of a guitar chord in a corridor and a voice singing about a man who came home from the mines with darkness on him, and the particular, devastating silence of 500 people who had just been reminded by a boy they had never heard of what a song is actually for. The industry sleeps, the awards gather dust, and the echo remains. What if the most important performance in the history of a gilded hall was never scheduled, never announced, never intended for the audience that heard it, but played, instead, in a dim corridor for a single listener who understood enough to bring it inside?